Welcome back to the Lydia Immigrant channel. Today I'm going to talk about contradictions in the case for the resurrection and how a maximal data person who argues for the resurrection by the maximal data method tackles the issue of gospel contradictions. Now, if you're interested in this kind of meta issue, maximal data versus minimal fact, you've no doubt heard the claim, the accusation. If you do a maximal data approach, you're going to have to stop every time someone brings up a alleged contradiction in the Gospels, and you're going to have an answer to it. You're going to be constantly derailed with a never-ending series of contradiction claims, and you're also going to have to know that you haven't answered every single one of them. And nobody can do that, and that's unreasonable, and that's why we shouldn't use maximal data. That's why we should use minimal facts, because this is entailed by the use of maximal data. Now, I've often talked about the fact that if there really is an epistemological problem with the minimal facts approach, as I've argued there is, then we don't have any choice but to find a better method. But I think it's also good to challenge this sort of straw man of what is entailed by the maximal data approach. So I want to talk about three different responses to claims of contradiction that a person who takes the maximal data approach should be incorporating into his thinking about all of this. How these are going to look, it's going to vary depending on whether you're in a debate, like a formal debate setting, or informally talking with a skeptic, maybe on Zoom, maybe at a coffee shop, etc. So I'm not going to try to go into all of the varieties of how these things might work out differently in different social settings. I'm going to hope that you can kind of take these principles and apply them. And for example, just to take one example, in a formal debate, you have your initial positive statement of the case, for which you have maybe 20 minutes or 25 minutes, something like that. I'm not going to recommend that you incorporate anything about contradictions into that 20-minute statement of the positive case. No doubt, some alleged contradictions between the Gospels, and especially the resurrection narratives, if the resurrection's the topic of your debate, no doubt that will come up in that cross-questioning section that you often have in a formal debate, where the two people sit down across from one another, they kind of go back and forth. Anyone, including someone doing the minimal facts approach, is going to have to sort of think ahead in that cross-questioning. What is the other person likely to bring up? What do I want to be prepared to say? And so forth. And there are going to be things that you're going to dig into in the cross-questioning that you didn't talk about in your initial statement. There's certainly not anything about doing a maximal data approach that says that you have to bring up alleged contradictions between the gospel resurrection narratives at the earlier point in the initial statement of your case. That would be a straw man. I mean, practically speaking, there's no reason why it should. But now I want to move on to my three broad principles for a maximalist to incorporate thinking about alleged gospel contradictions. So the first principle, maybe the most important, is categorize. This is a principle for thinking as well as for rhetoric and answering in an actual live situation. In your mind, you need to be categorizing contradictions and alleged contradictions. It's a really incorrect way to think about contradictions in the Gospels as a line, okay? Like it's a line and it goes off so long that it goes out of your sight, right? Each contradiction claim behind the one in front, another one behind that, behind that, etc. And you can't, it's like indefinite in length. That's wrong. Instead, you should think of alleged contradictions under various category headings. I mean, this isn't just true in the Gospels. This is true in history, and it's true in so many other areas, evaluating testimony and so forth, that they're going to fall under various categories. And these categories sometimes crosshatch. So, for example, you could have a category of things that would be trivial even if they couldn't be resolved, and things that would be kind of a big deal if they couldn't be resolved. And then you have, cross-hatching things that can be readily, reasonably resolved, and things that can't be readily, reasonably resolved, right? And you can imagine that those two can be cross-hatched to create four. And what's the category that you're most concerned about there? Things that would be a really big deal that cannot be reasonably resolved, right? That's the category that you want to be thinking about and asking yourself, are there such, okay, in the Gospels? Are there such in Acts and so forth? Am I saying that it's cut and dried whether something would be a big deal? No. I mean, there are going to be differences of opinion about that. But just thinking in those terms is really good for you. But also, let's suppose we think about things that can be reasonably resolved. We can also categorize those according to what kind of a move is being made in bringing the accusation of a contradiction in the first place. So, argument from silence, huge category in the skeptical community. And of course, I just finished a series on arguments from silence. I mean, sometimes you just want to see, where would you guys be if it weren't for the argument from silence against testimony in historical inquiry? Okay, so that's a biggie. Another category is overreading. You'll see Bart Ehrman doing this sometimes. I believe he actually says how does this go? In Matthew, Mary and Joseph are originally from Bethlehem. That's not verbatim, but it's something he's claimed. Now, it's really good to get to know your Gospels really well, because if you're unfamiliar or it's new or whatever, there's no shame in that. But you hear somebody just kind of state unqualifiedly, in Matthew, Mary and Joseph are from Bethlehem, whereas in Luke, Mary is from Nazareth and they come from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Okay, right? I mean, Bart Ehrman's a scholar. I guess he knows whether in Matthew, Mary and Joseph are really from Bethlehem in the first place, whether there's a contradiction here. Well, no, not necessarily. That's open to question. So you go and you read Matthew and you discover it doesn't say that Mary and Joseph are from Bethlehem. It's just that, in fact, the first mention of a town, Mary and Joseph are just sort of found in Bethlehem, but it doesn't say anything about their being originally from there. They're growing up there. They're being, there's nothing about that. You have a discussion of Joseph's dream and how disturbed he is to find out that Mary is pregnant in the previous chapter. It doesn't say anything about, where he's located when he has this dream or where Mary's from. It's just not addressed. So that's overreading, and a lot of contradiction claims are based on overreading. So you get the picture here. These categories where you say, no, it really doesn't say that. Another category is an unreasonable objection to multiple broadly similar events. I've talked about this many times. You think there were 2 temple cleansings. What kind of a weirdo are you, And it's not until you go read them that you realize, this was kind of a protest on Jesus' part. People engage in similar protests on multiple occasions in broad terms. There's nothing uncannily similar here. There's not extremely similar dialogue, for example. In fact, the dialogues he has with the leaders are somewhat different as between them. They could easily be two different events. So that's a third category that creates artificial contradiction claims. Now, what is so good about thinking this through and having these categories in your mind is that it enables you not to have to sort of run away from the whole topic of contradictions, whether one-on-one or in a debate scenario. So that brings me to my second important approach, which is keep the initiative by a well-justified confidence. Keep the initiative by a well-justified confidence. Now, a lot of times, the way that the minimal facts analyst will keep the initiative is by dismissing the entirety of claimed contradictions. I've seen, there's a quotation from Dr. William Lane Craig. He's not a minimal facts, but he is, in a broader sense, what I would call a minimalist in his approach to the resurrection argument. He says something like, I'll grant for the sake of the argument all that the skeptic wants to claim in terms of alleged contradictions. Now, that's a big amount to be granting when you stop to think about that. I mean, Bart Ehrman's waiting here in the wings. He's got a list longer than your arm, right? Do all of these fall into the doesn't matter category? Can you be sure about that? Okay? And what the minimalist approach does is to just try to reassure you, you don't need to look into this stuff at all, because none of it matters. Like, the whole category of alleged contradictions, it just doesn't matter. I was doing a recorded interview recently. It'll drop at some point coming along here. I'm not sure of the date when it's going to be released, so I won't say who it's with, but at a certain point, the question came up about alleged contradictions between the resurrection stories, and he was listing several of them. Like, I don't even remember what they all were, but, how many angels were at the tomb? That's a pretty common one that comes up. But then he also listed, did Jesus first appear in Galilee or in Jerusalem? And it was this kind of grocery list, and I said, well, now, that one's important. And here's why. If that really were a contradiction, that would be a problem. Because if the gospel stories actually come from the disciples themselves, presumably they knew whether Jesus appeared to them first, that first, glorious time when he appeared to them, whether it was in Jerusalem or Galilee, that those are not a stone's throw away from each other. They're several days' journey, at a minimum, away from one another. Then the circumstances are quite different between the stories recorded in Galilee and Jerusalem. So my confidence about the resurrection is not based upon just sort of taking all of the contradiction claims and sort of squishing them down, and like when you're trying to close an item of luggage, right? You push everything in and you try to zip it and it won't zip. You push that one in, and maybe you have somebody sit on it if it's a hard-shelled suitcase, and eventually you get it fastened. And the suitcase is called Doesn't Matter. Okay? And I sometimes wonder, not to psychologize too much, but to what extent people have, floating around in the back of their mind that something terrible is going to happen if you admit that some of these actually matter. And so they're just insistent. None of it matters. We can grant all of that and the case still goes through. And I don't think that's true. But it's okay. Because when you have categorized and when you've thought in terms of that, then you can have this confidence that comes from having actually looked at what you were otherwise trying to squeeze into the suitcase. You've actually looked and you've said, oh yeah, that one, I may not be sure whether Luke was maybe wrong about whether there were 11 people, maybe he hadn't heard that Thomas wasn't with them that first time around, but that's really no big deal. But this one over here about where did they first see Jesus? That's a biggie, but actually it's resolvable. Okay, it's reasonably resolvable. And you're making those distinctions, and then you're ready and you have that confidence so that when somebody comes at you, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? You can go, right? And you can sort of cut it up and you can say, that's easily resolvable, but it's not serious anyway. This one, yeah, maybe there's a minor error there, but it's not serious. If you're an inerrantist, you're not going to say that, but this is how I would do it. If you're an inerrantist, you might say, that one I don't know how to resolve, but that one really doesn't matter. This one would be big if it were a real contradiction, but in fact it's resolvable, and here's why, and you've thought it through, right? And then when you bring the person back, the attention back to the positive case, let's look at this in the big picture. There's this positive case, both for the reliability of the Gospels, so you've got that in your toolkit as well, the positive arguments for gospel reliability, positive arguments that these stories come from people in a position to know, okay? And then that feeds into your positive case for the resurrection itself. When you bring the person back to that, you have a justifiable confidence. There's not a guilty conscience like you're just saying, never mind that, okay? But you actually know whereof you speak because you've thought this through. And so this is why when you see someone saying, please don't make me do the maximal data case, I don't want to have to resolve all of these alleged contradictions, it's like, it's okay? You don't have to be able to resolve them all, but you need to kind of understand how the alleged contradictions are categorized, which ones might be real contradictions, which ones are more important than others, and so forth, and be ready then to show that also within the larger view of, look at all this evidence we have, and that doesn't mean you give it all, you dump the truck on them all in the first half hour, that's not my point, but you yourself know there's all this evidence that it's a privilege to discuss of the reliability of the Gospels and that they're not including made-up stories, okay? So categorize and then maintain initiative by a justified confidence, which arises in part from categorizing. And then last, answer selectively. Again, this may look different depending on whether you're one-on-one, whether you're online, whether you're in a formal debate or what. You may answer selectively based on a categorization. You might say, I want to talk about that one about whether Jesus appeared to them first in Galilee or in Jerusalem. Here's why it's no big deal. Here's in other words, it would be if it were a problem, but here's why it's not a problem. Give a brief version of that. So that might be one of your selection principles. But another way you could do it, if you're dealing with an individual, or perhaps even in a debate situation, give me your top three. This was a suggestion from Tim, by the way, and I like it. Tell me what your top three are that are alleged problems, with the Gospels or alleged problems with the resurrection stories, and I will give you my take on that. Now, you're opening yourself up at that point that you want to be prepared enough that you're going to have something to say about what that person's top three are. If it's in a debate, everybody does debate prep, right? Find out what Bart Ehrman's top three are likely to be, or top five, or whatever. And there's plenty of material out there on that, right? If it's one-on-one, it's more casual. If the person brings one up that you don't know the answer to, it's perfectly fine to say, I haven't looked into that one. I will get back to you on that. That's fine. You don't have to pretend to know more than you actually know. But you're answering selectively. And part of the reason that you're answering selectively is because you're trying just a little bit to give your audience, and maybe even your one-on-one person you're talking to, or if it's being, streamed or something, your audience, you're trying to give them a picture of that big picture. You're trying to communicate to them that you're not just evading all alleged contradictions, or even the possibility of any real contradiction. You're not evading that. You're not just saying, I'm not going to talk about that. But that at the same time, that's not the whole of it, right? That's not, okay, I'm making a case for the resurrection, and basically what I'm going to do here all night long is to answer alleged contradictions because that's what it's all about. No, you're avoiding what's been called the fallacy of objections. That if there are a bunch of objections and I don't know the answers to all the objections, then my case falls to the ground. That's not a good way to approach anything, any topic in history or science or crime or whatever. So you're trying to break them away from the view that what this is all about is just answering alleged contradictions, but you're also not ignoring them. So those are my 3 principles. First, categorize and organize your own study in that way as well, and your own thinking in that way. Second, maintain the initiative by a justified confidence based in part on categorizing. And 3, answer selectively. I think those are some good principles for approaching the issue of contradictions within a generally maximalist approach to arguing for Christianity. I hope that's helpful, and I hope you'll come back next time. I'm Lydia McGrew.